I am working on a Frederick's watercolor canvas board. I started out by painting it just a solid brown orange type color just to get a base color on there. I then had my clownfish drawn out on a piece of tracing paper, and I used transfer paper to transfer the image over. I do have a blog coming up sometime very, very soon that's going to show you exactly how I did that on this project. So I know I've had a few of you ask about that. So that is coming soon. But once I had everything blocked out or drawn out where I wanted with the anemone and the clownfish, I'm just coming through with the airbrush, and I am going to layer a lot of colors. I probably had 10 or 11 different bottles of Acrylic paint out. I do water that down quite a bit because straight is just too thick to feed through this airbrush. This is the Iwata Neo. It has a very small needle, and yeah, that airbrush paint is really thick, but I like it because it dries very flat, so it looks like it fits in seamlessly with my Liquitex Basics paint. It doesn't look like I'm using two different types of paint when I use these together. Once you varnish it, it doesn't really matter anyway. It's going to even out the gloss, but I just like how these work together. So you can see I'm just starting to build up some of the shapes in here, and I'm holding the airbrush back away from the canvas quite a bit. When you're airbrushing, the closer the airbrush is to the canvas, the finer or more sharp that detail is. So with this, because I want this to be blurry, I can be very sloppy, and I'm holding that airbrush away from the canvas. I don't need a lot of control for this. It's something that if you have no experience with the airbrush, you can still do this and have it look just as good as anything I've done, as long as you just keep layering it. And this does require a dual action airbrush. You do not want the single action because it doesn't give you control of how thin or thick your lines are, so that really wouldn't be suitable. You do need the full airbrush kit with this. And as I'm working, you're going to see that most of this looks like really bad spray paint. Like, it does not look like it's ever going to look realistic. You just have to trust that if you keep layering, it will get there. Now for these first areas with the dark portions, I am using straight black, but I'm going to be airbrushing reds and blues on top of that so that it's not flat black. It's easier for me at this point just to block that in with the straight color and not deal with mixing, and then I just get more glazing anyway later on, which is always a good thing. When I'm doing this, I'm copying my reference photo mostly. I'm not stressing out about every little thing being exact. It's a blurry background. It doesn't really matter. I did like the balance of where the lights and the darks are, but I don't need every little thing to be exact. I just need to go for close. And one little tip, if you guys are trying to get this blurry background on your own reference photos, you've taken something and you want to blur something out more, play around with Photoshop. If you're not sure how that photo, if you've got like a really crisp, let's say it's a landscape photo or a forest, you don't know what that would look like where it was blurry, put it into Photoshop and put a filter on it. You've got the Gaussian blur, which I'm probably mispronouncing. I'm sure one of you guys can correct me on that one. But use that blur feature and blur that so you can see what that would look like as a blurry background. It's a lot easier than taking a photo that's really crisp and trying to guess what it would look like blurry. And again, we're still at that, look, I'm spray painting and it looks terrible stage. I promise, I'm going somewhere with this. And I know this week was supposed to be the how to draw a hand tutorial, but I screwed up my schedule and it turned out this video, it's a promotional thing for a stock photo website, and so I needed to have this one done this week, and so I'm just flipping those two. So the how to draw a hand tutorial will be next week. I do have that project finished though, so at least I'm a little ahead now, which is good because I was getting behind. I'm coming back on top now with some white and adding some highlights here. And when I do the white is one of the few colors that's completely opaque. The white and the black are very opaque. The rest of the colors, even if they're marked as opaque, they're not going to be as opaque as white or black paint. So by putting the white in here, I'm able to then airbrush a more translucent color over it, but still have that lighted area. I had an eraser bit or something was stuck on the canvas that I had to scrape off there. The paint was catching on it. Every single time that I do a background like this, and I mean every time, I always have those moments of doubt where it's like, this looks terrible. Maybe I should start over. This isn't coming out right. And every time it works its way out. It's one of those things that it just doesn't look good as you're layering it. And you can definitely cause those areas or that feeling of, I'm not going to be able to pull this one off. You just have to keep layering. And with the airbrush and doing it this way, because I do have the ability to come back through with the opaque colors, I can cover anything. If I mess something up, if I really made something go terribly wrong, I'm just going to cover it up. It's not a big deal. So if you do try this, don't get frustrated and give up with it. Now, I also want to give you guys a bit of advice here. If you are airbrushing and you're new to that, make sure you're keeping that airbrush very clean as you work. I keep a spray bottle where I can continuously mist colors. When I switch colors out, I will spray that off into a bucket that I have next to me and run water through it until that's coming out clean. Once that paint starts to dry, and it'll dry inside the very, very tip, and I cannot think of the word for that part. It's a tiny, tiny little area that the needle sticks out of. Once that starts to dry, that is really the main thing that'll start clogging your airbrush, and it's harder to clean. What I do when that does happen, because this paint does have a tendency to clog the airbrush, I pull the airbrush apart, unscrew that section, and I soak it in hot water until that paint can kind of be scraped out. I use an old airbrush needle to pull that out. They have cleaners or kits that have brushes and such to clean your airbrush out, but none of those are really small enough for what I need when I get the paint blocked in that tip. Now you have to be careful. You don't want to be jamming an old needle into that tip because you can damage it. I have ripped mine open because that metal that they use on the tip, is, at least on this model, is very flimsy. So you do want to be careful of that. You can replace that part if you need to. But if I soak it in the hot water for a while first, that helps to loosen up the paint that dries in there. If I don't soak it first and just try scraping it out, I never get it clean enough. So that will help you if you do start having it clogging. I pull the entire airbrush apart on occasion and soak the whole thing in hot water and clean it out as good as I can if I start having it clog regularly. But before I ever put paint in that, after I paint, or if I haven't been painting for a few weeks, because usually I'll go weeks in between each medium, if I haven't painted in a while, I'm going to run water through it and make sure I've got good flow. If paint dried, I didn't get it clean enough the time before I painted, it is really frustrating to not find out until I've put paint in the airbrush itself and it's bubbling up, and then you have to dump all that paint and it's a mess. So I always run water through first and make sure that's flowing through perfect, that I've got the amount of pressure that I should have. If not, it goes and gets soaked in hot water right now, because that's really the only way I'm ever able to fix that all the way. But as I work, I also will run through it's by Createx. They have an airbrush cleaner, and I will run that through occasionally as well, along with water as I go. And when I mix the paint, because I do thin it down with water, I spray with the spray bottle a little bit of water into the cup and then add a few drops of the paint itself. I use a brush and just kind of mix it in the cup itself on the airbrush. So that's kind of how I keep it from getting too many thick clumps of paint, which those thick clumps are part of what will also clog the airbrush. So those are my little tips for you guys if you are having a hard time, if you're using the same materials I have or am, and you are having it clog. Those are some things that can help not to have that happen as badly. And this entire time that I painted on this one, I really didn't have any problems with the airbrush clogging up, but I had cleaned it out well last time I had used it, so that definitely helps. And you may think that that's common sense, but all of us, that it's so common, and especially with this paint, it clogs. If you don't want to deal with the clogging paint, you might want to try Calm Art. That one is a much thinner one. I never had problems with that one clogging. It's more translucent and it's not as permanent until you use a spray varnish on it. That one can be lifted off if you add a little water or have an accident there. It's harder to hide that. This I find to be much more forgiving and works better with the way that I paint. But if I were to do a complete painting, that Calm Art is really, really nice. It's so much easier to get fine detail with and to keep your airbrush from clogging. So you can see I'm starting to build up where it's starting to look more realistic. It still is a hot mess, but I'm getting there at this point. One of the things that I ended up doing is I took a photo of this one and loaded it into Photoshop, put it right next to my reference photo because I knew that this wasn't quite right and I wasn't able to pinpoint what I was missing, what was off. So I imported it into Photoshop, put it right next to that reference photo so they were the same size, side by side, and I was easily able to see I was completely missing a few colors in there, like a deep burgundy color I needed. My olive greens needed to be more severe. So that really helped putting the photos side by side like that. And that really doesn't matter which medium you're working in. If you can really get them on, and it's easier to see when you put it on the computer versus just putting, if you've printed out your reference photo and put it next to your art, sometimes that's not as easy to see. Shrink them down, get them side by side on your computer screen, and you will notice so many things you didn't notice before. So you can see I'm coming through and adding a lot of dots now. And they're soft dots. I've still got that airbrush held at a fair distance from the canvas. And every so often I do have to take my fingernails and scrape the paint. It'll start to dry on the tip, the nozzle, the needle that sticks out there. I will just kind of scrape that off with my fingernails. Now I am asked all the time how to do a blurry background like this with acrylic paints and not using an airbrush. You know what? With acrylics, the only way to have it really look like this is to use an airbrush. And I know that's not the answer people want, but it was one of the reasons I initially bought an airbrush, because there were certain things with acrylic paint that you just can't get that look without the airbrush. It's definitely on my must-have supply list for painting. With oils, it's easy enough. You're just going to be blending more, and they blend easy enough that you can do that. But with acrylics, you can get something out of focus. It's not that you can't get things out of focus. It's just not going to look quite like it will if you use an airbrush. You can try dry brushing if you're working on a canvas that's really smooth like this one, but it would just be so much more work, and it's still not going to look as good as it will if you had had an airbrush. So if you guys are painting this one, for example, and you don't have that airbrush, I would keep that background a lot more simple. You can still have it have the depth. I wouldn't try to get that many colors, that much layering and details in that background without the airbrush. Just pick a few colors and blend them softly, wet into wet, and that's how I would leave that if I did not have the airbrush. I would not try to get something that involved in that background without it. Now, the anemone the portions of the anemone that is behind the clownfish, that needs to be out of focus too. So I'm going to airbrush most of it. I will come back through with the paintbrush because I do want it slightly more in focus than the live rock that's behind it. But I do want to airbrush a lot of this to keep it soft. And you can see, again, I'm not putting that airbrush too close to the canvas. I don't want sharp, sharp lines here. If I do, then it's no longer out of focus. Don't worry, I don't use the airbrush for very much on this piece. I'm just going to get a little bit more on the anemone in the background, and then I'm going to put the airbrush away and be working solely with a paintbrush. So if you don't have an airbrush, don't feel like that's all you're going to get out of this video. I will definitely be doing a lot of brush work. Most of this is done with the brush. Now, where I was talking about if you are going to clean your airbrush and use a needle to kind of scrape the paint out, make sure it's an old needle. Don't use the needle you're currently using because you will bend the tip on those. They are very fragile and they bend really easily. And once you bend the tip, you have no control over which direction that paint wants to come out. Even if you think it looks straight, you'll be using it and the paint will be shooting out kind of to the side. So don't ever use your good needles to clean or scrape anything away. I always only use needles that are already damaged, usually because I dropped the airbrush and they hit the floor wrong or the easel. So those are the ones that I'll use to scrape paint if I need to. And when I say scrape, I'm not adding much pressure. You want to be very gentle with it because some of the parts on there do bend and do have issues with that. You also want to make sure when you put certain portions of that airbrush together, again, if you have taken it apart, I've had one time with the tip of I was using my no, it was not the Iwata, it was the Tamiya airbrush I think. But that one, the nozzle on that one, I had screwed back into the airbrush when I pulled it apart to clean. I screwed it in too tight and it stripped it, and it broke it. I had to replace that part completely. So you want to be gentle when you put it back, different parts back together. Don't take a wrench and really screw it in, you know, heavy. Be fairly gentle with that. The other thing is, again, when you're scraping it out with a needle, if you have to do that, which if you're keeping it clean enough, that's not going to really be an issue, but it occasionally happens. If you do that, be gentle again, because that part, especially on the Iwata Neo, the one that I'm using in this video, that one really, that nozzle is so flimsy, and that metal just completely bent, like split up the side when I was trying to get the paint out of it. So I'm just loosely blocking in just because I already had paint in that airbrush, loosely blocked in some of the other anemones in the background, or some in the foreground, and even the yellow on the clownfish. Not because that needed to be done, but because I put the wrong color in the airbrush, and I was like, hey, it's here, I may as well airbrush some of this. But it was completely unnecessary. I just felt like I didn't want to waste the paint, which was silly because I knew I was going to cover it up anyway. We're artists. We don't always have to use logic. So you can see I'm mixing, I've got a deeper burgundy that I'm using on a lot of this. And I am letting some of that initial color, that orangey brown color that I had painted the canvas, I'm letting a lot of that show through. That was such a great color to go with because it's fairly neutral, and it is a color that is in a lot of this. So the anemone, I was able to let it work for me instead of having to repaint every little bit of the anemone a new color. Just let that work for me here. And it saved a lot of time. Now this portion, while it does look better if it's airbrushed with the anemone because I can keep it out of focus, I could do that with a paintbrush. That part's not as big of a deal as getting the background, the really blurry live rock in the background done. And that I would just do with glazing. And you'll see that later on when I start working on the anemone. I start doing quite a bit of glazing on him. So I'm starting to add some details. This is a very pale lavender pink type color. Now these bits I will paint highlights on later on, just with a brush. You can see I've airbrushed quite a bit of the anemones behind the clownfish right now, and that is an area that I have way too light. Until I got the clownfish blocked in, I realized that he was not standing out enough, and it's because the color of the anemone, the way that I had it, was just too similar. So I ended up being able to go back and glaze, and this is where I like the Createx paints, airbrush paint so much, because had I used Com Art, the Com Art would have lifted completely. I couldn't glaze on top of that with paint, whereas the Createx, words, they're hard. The Createx really does stick much better to the canvas. It's more permanent than the Com Art is. You'll see, because I do use water on here, that paint, if it starts to feel a little too thin, if I keep layering and layering and layering, it doesn't dry as fast as if I were using an actual mixing medium. So I have to take the hairdryer occasionally and dry that. And I don't use the mixing medium just because I really like how the water looks or how that works. And that's going to be the same as adding water to your regular acrylic paints. The more you add, the less adhesive it is. Once you varnish it, it's no big deal. It's permanent, it's not coming off. But if I airbrush or I have it super thin down with water, then if I were to be scrubbing or doing different types of blending techniques over that paint, it can start to lift off. So you have to be a little bit careful with that. And the more water you use, the more translucent that color is going to be as well. It's all kind of a balancing act. Everything has pros and cons. You just have to figure out how to work around those. So that was all done in the first night. I spent maybe an hour, maybe two, not too long, getting that background painted in. Now I'm going to come back through and start working with the actual brush work. And you can see I'm better defining some of the arms of the anemone here. Even on the blurry ones, I'm just slightly defining that. And I've done this before. You guys have seen this before, where I will take a softer brush, like these are all Taklon bristled brushes here. That is a round Taklon. I will also be using a filbert Taklon bristled brush, and then using a stiff round brush to smudge my edges, just to soften that out. And for getting any sort of blurry background or the blurriness of the anemone arms, that's how I would do that if I wasn't airbrushing that portion. And I think you can do that and have it look pretty much very similar anyway to what I did with the airbrush. It would just be a lot harder on the full background, especially with these being smaller areas to smudge and blur out. That's part of what makes it so much easier. Now, most of the colors that I'm going to use to block these areas in, they're going to look flat and dull, and the anemone is not going to have the glowy look that I want until I come back later on and start glazing. I am using raw umber, I believe, for most of this. I'm using a bit of orange and some white and a little bit of magenta, but the majority of the shading I'm doing with that raw umber and white. I'm making sure to let that background work for me. I don't want to cover up all of that base color that I had, because that base color is a good color for this. It's very similar to the anemone in the reference photo. Now, I did adjust the reference photo or the color in that anemone a bit just to make the clownfish pop out more. I used a bit more with the magentas than I did with the oranges and browns. But to start with, I just stuck with the browns and white for the most part. Just copied the reference photo, paid attention to where the lights and darks went. I was not worrying about little teeny details at this point. I'm not worried about my edges being perfect. I'll come back later on and clean all of that up. And those edges will need to be very clean and very perfect when I get up close, because if they're not, then that kills the whole 3D look that I'm going for here. That's one of the things that's so nice about doing the blurry backgrounds, is it does give you that more three-dimensional look. Now that white you can see is really harsh. I'm just going to blend that out with that stiff round brush. And I will put a link in the video description to sets of those that you can buy on Amazon. You can also pick them up. Last I checked, Michaels still had the ones that came in the set, like a link on Amazon that was in the canvas brush holder. And I call them stiff round brushes. Some people, or some of the websites that I've seen, call those brushes synthetic hog hair. They're terrible if they're supposed to be synthetic. If that is even remotely supposed to be hog hair, it's a terrible excuse. But some of the websites I know do link them as that. I just don't call them that because it's not. But they're very inexpensive and they work great for this technique. And a lot of these will work better as they start to get more stiff. So I don't do a very good job of keeping those ones clean. My softer brushes, the Taklon bristled brushes, I make sure those are always clean. But the stiff round brushes that I'm using here, those ones, I let them be a little bit damaged. I don't clean them that well because they work better for me when they stiffen up a bit. And they work better when they're a little bit more dry. If they get very wet, well, you've got to balance it out anyway. So we'll back up and explain that first. You want to balance out how much water, if your paint is very wet, you're going to want your stiff round brush to be more dry. If your paint is drying or fairly dry on the brush that you're applying it with, that Taklon bristled brush, like the one that I'm using here, if that's more dry, then I need my stiff round brush to be a little bit more damp. And I mean a little bit, not much. If you have too much water on there, or if it's too damp, then it will just lift the paint you just did, which is not really the look we're going for here. But you have to balance those out, how much water versus how much paint. If one brush has more water, then the other brush needs less. And it doesn't matter which is which. I mean, they balance each other. But when they're more damaged and a little bit more stiff, I find that they just blend a lot better. When they get very wet, if you have just rinsed it, say you were taking a break, you rinsed the brush off really well, you come back, that brush is very wet or even just very damp, it won't blend right. It just kind of flops over. Once the brushes have been more damaged and you haven't been cleaning them as well, then they tend to, they can handle a little bit more water without just being too floppy. And this is very much like where I painted the flamingo, where I'm just more focused on my values than worrying about the color being exact yet. Just blocking in approximately where everything goes. That was a mop brush you just saw me use. I was starting to get too many brush strokes within that area that I had just painted. So I just took the mop brush, went over that, and it softened it all out. And that brush only works when you're blending wet into wet. If you're blending wet into a dry area, you want to use your stiff round brush to blend that edge, like what I'm using right there. But for a larger area, if it's all wet paint and you've got the brush strokes, that mop brush, just lightly letting the bristles touch that paint or wipe over them, then that can soften that out for you. And I do have a video showing you guys how to do wet into wet. I will put a link in the description for that too. For this, it's such a small area. The wet into wet wasn't really a big deal. They're just little teeny areas, so you won't need to use the mop brush much at all. And this is a lot like the flamingo feathers again, in that I've just got to watch where those highlights are. It may not make sense. I mean, this one individual piece, that doesn't really look like a piece or a part of an anemone. I have to trust that when it all comes together, then it will look right. And this is also like the flamingo or painting feathers in that I don't need all of these to be exact. If one of these arms of the anemone are a little bit shorter, a little bit too curved, any of that, no one's going to know the difference. I'm not going to stress myself out and spend a lot of time making sure every little thing on there is exact. I need it to be close. I'm going to look at the reference photo and go for close, but I'm not going to freak myself out if it's not exact either. See, I add the highlight and then I smudge that out with a stiff round brush. And when I smudge it out on somewhere like that one that I just did, I don't need that outside edge to be very soft. So it's really only the inside edge of that line that I'm softening. I'm not just scribbling all over the place. I've got to pay attention to which edge I want sharp and which edge I want soft. Really watch for that. And you don't need to overblend it. I think that's one thing that I see people make a lot of mistakes with, is that they'll take that stiff round brush and keep blending and blending and smudging and blending and smudging, and they end up almost creating this ring where they push all of the paint away from the center area, and they just have this ring around the edge. Don't do that. You can see I'm only needing to do a couple of brush strokes, a little bit of smudging, and then I move on. And that's really true with most blending, whether it be oil or English, again, it's hard. And whether it be oil or acrylic, a lot of people want to overblend those. Don't overdo it. It really doesn't usually need very much to get the look that you're going for. If it's not blending in just a couple of brush strokes, something else is going wrong. It may be an issue of how much water you've got on the brush or how wet the blending brush or the stiff round brush is. It's probably something else if you have to work that hard to blend. You can see the colors here. Again, they're fairly dull right now. Totally okay, because the glazing that I will do later will give it that glow that I want. And this is one of those things that can definitely start feeling very tedious. Don't let yourself get overwhelmed by it. Take breaks as you need to. Do a couple little of the, or so hard to talk. Do a couple of the little arms and then move on to the next area. Or do a couple of the little arms and then take a break. Walk away if you need to. But don't try to do all of them at the same time. For me, for this one, I needed to get this done very quickly, and so I found the fastest way to do it was I got the first couple of arms mostly done so that I had a general understanding of what colors I wanted to use, and then I went through and blocked in the rest of them much more quickly, where I've got a lot of the brown in the same area, or I would block in the brown in a lot of the different sections, and then I would block in the white separately versus just doing one or two arms at a time. And the reason that I did that is instead of doing it all at once was that let me jump around without having to continuously pull the hair dryer out to dry each section. While one dried, I could block in all of the brown on the next section. While that brown dried, I could go back and add the white highlights on the other without smudging my brown and my white together too much if I didn't want to. I have a feeling that made no sense. It makes sense in my head though. But this type of thing is actually really, really good practice for blending the wet into dry like what I'm doing here with that stiff round brush balanced with the Taklon bristled brushes. With this much shading, you get really good at it by the end. And it's definitely more forgiving if you are using that smoother canvas like this. I love these watercolor canvas boards for acrylic painting for this type of blending. It is so much easier than trying to use a canvas that has a little bit more tooth. Even just a little bit more tooth will make this type of blending a huge pain. And watch, I know a lot of the stores will carry generic watercolor canvases. Hobby Lobby carries one, their Masters Touch, Master something. It's their generic brand. And I've had issues with putting holes through that canvas that I have never had on any other canvas. And I've had it happen a couple of times. So I do not recommend the generic watercolor canvases. The watercolor canvas boards, the generic ones, may be okay. I'm not sure with that. But the watercolor canvases, when I was putting the hanger on it or framing, I had issues where just the screwdriver slipped a little and barely touched the canvas and went right through it. And no other canvas I've worked on does that. And they're going to be a little bit flimsier because it's such a fine canvas anyway, but I've not had that happen with the Frederick's watercolor canvases. Usually I just go with the watercolor canvas boards though. That was definitely a huge thing that moved me into being so firm on I will only work on Frederick's canvases. You can only have things on your work that you've spent hours and hours on go wrong so many times before you're like, that's it. It isn't worth the trouble. You can see I'm leaving that outside edge fairly harsh, and I'm not going to do too much on these the portions of the anemones that are going in front of the clownfish, because I know that when I blend out the clownfish, I would mess up those edges anyway. So I'm just loosely blocking in where they go. I will worry about cleaning that up better a little bit later. This really is just a rinse and repeat. Once you get the hang of one of these little tentacle arms, the rest are pretty easy. Tentacle arms. I am just making up terms that do not go with anemone. Now these ones back here, I don't want them to be quite as in focus as the other ones. These need to be fairly soft. See, now I'm coming back through and adding some of these highlights, and look how those highlights just push that forward so much. It makes it feel like it's so much closer to you. Coming back through on these now. It's just so much easier because I already have the darks in, so it's really quick to come through now and add all of these highlights. See, I'm just really smudging that inside edge and leaving the outside edge very, very harsh. Now on some of these, if the stiff round brush doesn't feel like it's really blending it soft enough, I'm switch over to a damp filbert brush. That's a Taklon bristled filbert brush, and I just brush it a couple of brush strokes along that edge, and that will soften it out as well. So I'm drying this off with a hairdryer. I need to make sure that it is completely dry before I start glazing. If I start glazing it and the white highlights I just did, if they are slightly wet, they will just lift right off the canvas. Now here I am just glazing orange with a little bit of red. Mostly it's just orange. And that orange is very, very translucent, and so you can see all of the details, the highlights and shadows that I did right under it. But that's not going to be enough on its own. I'm not just going to stop there. I'm going to come back through, add more highlights, and then glaze, and then more highlights, and this is just a very long layering process. A lot of people seem to be under the impression that when you paint things, you just need to put the right color in the right place. Yeah, that would be great if you were doing a paint by number. But when it's something like this, if you're going for photorealism, there are going to be a lot of layers. I remember the first time I heard how many layers, a friend of mine who is an amazing artist, he showed me something that he had done and he said it was about 60 layers. And my jaw just hit the floor because I was still under the impression that it was a matter of just put the right color in the right place and it'll look realistic. And that just isn't really how it works. With the paint, a lot of it is how the light refracts through each layer, and that's where a lot of the depth comes. It doesn't capture so much in photograph, but when you see it in person, it really makes a big difference. You can see it's starting to get that bit of a glow where the orange is covering the highlighted areas. Still a bit on the dull side, but getting there. Coming back through with more of the burgundy color over a lot of this, just for the darker portions. So you can see where early on, the brown that I was using, the raw umber, it's very, almost a grayish brown. It's very dull, but when you glaze these colors on top of it, it just creates a very nice shadow, but you still get the richness in color. So coming back through with highlights. Now for the majority of the highlights at this point, I am using the transparent mixing white. I'm going to hold off on using titanium white till I need things really opaque. And for these highlights here, where I am going more opaque on the very tips, I'm using titanium white mixed with a peach color. It's not straight white. This reference photo comes from a website called Graphic Stock. It's one where you can pay an annual fee and you can download as many of their reference photos as you want. That one, they are having a deal that will be announced probably on Wednesday. I've got to wait for that video to be approved because it is a sponsored video. But when that one is approved, there will be a code where you can get a free week's membership and download 140 of their images to use for free. So you can get this photo. Go head over there and sign up for that free trial membership thing and go ahead and download this one if you do want to paint it. And you'll see in that one, the anemone was a bit more on the brown orange color than what I ended up going with. I used more magenta because I didn't want it to blend in as much with the clownfish. I really wanted that clownfish to pop out, but still work with the piece as a whole. So with this one, being that I am using so many oranges, the best way to add a different color when you're trying to figure out, okay, I know I want to change the color, what should I change it to? Well, here I've got these oranges, and magenta pretty much always looks good with orange. And so that's what I went with. I used a lot of the burgundies and magentas to make that color, or when I adjusted it, that's why I went with the colors that I did. So here I'm glazing more yellow. And I'm not going to leave this yellow, but it helps just to create more of that glow underneath the colors that I'm going to put over it. And the yellow, I don't have to thin that out very much. Yellow is so translucent all on its own. I don't need a lot of water with that. Now I've mixed this pale orange. There's white mixed with the orange color. And I'm adding the little dots, little highlights. This is where the detail comes in, and the detail on the reference photo, these are more uniform than what I went with. I just need to create the texture. I don't need this to be completely exact to still have it look photorealistic. If I wanted to go hyper realistic, then yeah, that I'm going to need to copy every little thing exact, and I would also have to spend about 80 hours doing what I spent 6 hours doing. So that makes a big difference. But for what I'm going for here, I'm just doing little dots, and I'm moving through this very quickly. I've got the highlight, and then as I come down the edge here, I'm adding the little dots to create the texture on the anemone. I think a lot of what you're painting, you've got to figure out, and because I know a lot of you guys are doing realism, you have to figure out what your end goal is. Does it look that much different if you make every tiny thing exact? I personally don't think that it does, and so I'm going to save the time and just create something that looks like a very similar texture. You can see I'm kind of fading that out from that highlight on the edge there. The actual texture on the reference photo, they were almost more like diamond shapes, and they were very uniform in rows and very, very tiny. But at a distance, all you really saw was the texture that I'm creating here. You had to be right up on top of it to notice that there would have been much difference. I'm just watching that reference photo to see where the majority of them are kind of clumped together. It's not that I want to make these dots on every single area of the anemone. That won't look right either. I've got to watch the location on that reference photo where they really stand out. I think with something like this, keep in mind you can always come back and add more. It's better to do not enough and go back and add more than to do too much and have to try to cover it up. And this will get glazed over as well, which will also tone them down. You can see they're finally starting to come to life and look more realistic. But look how many layers I had to do to get to this point, and I'm still not done. I always love seeing the comments on Facebook and Instagram where I'll post an in progress shot and people will say, well, I thought it looked done now. And I always think, just wait till it's actually done when you can see the difference where you continue to work on something. So many people are afraid to mess something up. They would get to this stage and go, it looks good. I don't want to keep working on it because I'm afraid I'm going to mess it up. You're not going to mess it up. Worst case scenario, you have to repaint one area. Not that big of a deal. Keep working on it until it looks exactly how you want it to. Another thing to point out here, look how far into this painting we are, and I haven't even started the clownfish. How much attention and how much detail has to be spent on the background when you're doing something like this. A lot of people will want to skip over or rush over a background. Don't. Every bit of that painting is just as important as every other bit. Pay the same amount of attention no matter what area it is. You may think, well, this is just a blurry part of the background, or this is just part of an anemone. Who cares? Just paint it. Make sure you get it just right, because it really will make a big difference in the piece as a whole. If you get your background right, it'll make your subject look even that much better. Just a little bit more glazing here with that burgundy color. So on to the clownfish. I am starting with yellow here. And while it is pretty translucent, my background is so light, it's not that big of a deal. But for the lighter portions, that's where I'm going to add a bit of white. I've got the transparent mixing white mixed into the really light areas. And then the areas where I want more orange, I can just use straight yellow, because it is so translucent up against that background. Right now I'm just creating the general shape of the face. Now on something like this, if I were doing a small clownfish, I'm not going to put this much detail into it, but being that this is a bigger piece, well, it's an 11 by 14, but the clownfish is really big, I'm going to get a lot more detail than I would on my full marine pieces where there's lots of fish. So the other thing here, don't think that it's just solid orange, black, and white, because you think clownfish, that's what colors you would use. Yeah, but look at all of the shading that needs to happen. And then on top of that, I'm going to pull burgundies and purples and blues. There are going to be a lot more colors in addition to that. So just don't think, oh, I just need those colors and I'll paint it in solid and it'll look good. You've got to look at all the shading and the dimension that I've got to get in forming the shape of the head here. So here I'm just using the straight orange. Adding a little bit more red when I want to get into the deeper portions. Remember, do not mix black in with the yellow when you're shading, because you will end up with a really ugly color. Use other colors to shade yellow, purple being one of them if you really want something to be a lot darker. So onto the eye, I am using a synthetic hog-haired liner brush, and I'm going to block in where the black areas are. I really want to pay attention to where the rings, there's these rings of orange around it. It would be easy to accidentally cover all of that just with black and think to come back with the detail, which you can do. But here it's actually easier if you just put the black where it needs to go and let that background color show through where the areas are going to be orange. Because if you did the black down on the whole eye area and then needed to get the rings of orange inside of that, you would first have to let the black dry, paint the areas you wanted orange white, let that dry, then come back on top with the orange because of the orange being so translucent. So here, it's easier for me just to let the orange in the background show through. And I'm dotting all of these little teeny tiny sections around that eye because it is not solid all the way through. Lining that edge where the black and, or well, the white and the orange meet. On this guy, I believe he's a false percula. He's got more black than you usually see from the true perculas. They're hard to tell. You have to count spines, and I can't do that on this photo. It doesn't really show. But anyway, for these guys, this one specifically has a lot of black transitioning. It's not just orange and white stripes. I've got this black in between, and that black is amazing for giving you more detail. On a fish like this that seems very simple, you really need to depend on every little teeny tiny detail area. Don't skip out on them because it makes it look less interesting. I don't know. With this sort of thing, on a lot of this, I actually want to create, and I often will create on certain fish, more detail than what is actually in that reference photo. And that is just because they tend to look flat and are often missing a lot if you don't. Now, this guy, this reference photo, there was a lot of detail. And I did tone down the scales because these guys, when you actually see them in person, you don't see all of those scales. They were catching on this photo because of the lens the photographer used, I believe. But I didn't go as harsh on that, but I do want to make sure on all of these areas, like where the black transitions from the black into the orange, I want to make sure I get all of that detail in there. And then again, I'm going to come back through and even add more detail on with highlights on the fish that aren't in that photo. And even if you don't sign up for that free trial that you'll see the link for tomorrow, you can still go and see this reference photo, see what I'm looking at. It's on their site. It just has their big logo across it, or copyright logo. So I'm just going to block this in with white. I'm trying to soften out that back edge. I don't want a real harsh transition from the white up against the anemone there. So I'm keeping that very soft. That's where I'm switching over to that stiff round brush and just smudging out that back edge. And I'm going to block this in. Now, this is another area that I adjusted. On the reference photo, the white is just straight white. There is no transition with shadows or anything on there, and it looks too flat. So I came back through, and you'll see this later on. I'm going to come back through with purples and a little bit of orange and magenta. I used quite a few different colors in that white to get more of a realistic look, which is funny because you'd think, well, copy the photo. That's going to give you the more realistic look. Sometimes with fish, it looks more realistic if you deviate away from that some and add more detail or adjust color some. Like when I paint Moorish idols, that is Gil in Finding Nemo. Most people seem to know him by that. But when I do Moorish idols, I will do more detail with lines of orange than what's actually in the fish, and it actually helps him to look more realistic than if I copy the reference photos exactly. And there aren't many animals that I really do that on. It's mostly just the fish that I find certain details adding extra can help it to look more realistic than the photo itself. So here, I was able to barely see this line. It was very faint, but I could sort of see that line up against the black and the orange there. I hyped that up even more to give myself that bit of extra detail that I'm looking for. And I will glaze over that with orange so it's not so bright, but it's easier here to make that really stand out where I want. You can see I'm using straight white, and then I will come through and glaze. So it looks kind of ridiculous right now when I have the white so harsh, but it won't stay that way. forming the edge of the mouth. Here's another area that I'm changing a bit from the reference photo. I'm adding a highlight on that outside edge just a bit. I'm going to tone that down more, but I want just a little bit to separate it more from the anemone, which will get separated more later when you see I'll end up having to glaze a lot of brown to tone that background down, which will push the fish forward even more. But right now I've got a little bit of a highlight there to separate him. Now the black edge that's rimming or going around up against the white there, I smudged that out, but I did it while the yellow was dry. I don't want to blend the black into the yellow while the yellow is wet because you end up with this horrible muddy color. So instead, knowing that I needed that black to transition and be right up against the oranges and yellows, I made sure that the oranges and yellows were completely dry before I painted the black, and then I just smudged it out with that stiff round brush. But that's not an area I would do wet into wet because you get some really not very good colors that way. So you can see as I'm darkening up right behind the face here to make the face pop forward more, I'm adding that wet paint and then I'm softening it out with the mop brush, which keeps it very, very soft, very much like the blurry background portions that I had airbrushed. So I'm taking this darker burgundy color around the eye a bit there. Just better defining it. I'm adding more highlights. I'm using white with a little bit of yellow in it, and I'll end up glazing over it so it's not so white. I was torn on this one. I almost left that white really white because that's what it is on the reference photo. But I just know from experience from having painted so many clownfish in the past that it doesn't look as realistic even though that's what's on that photo. White is going to reflect what's around it, and the lights that were on this fish or in that tank that the photo was taken in is likely why that was lit up the way it was. But I need to get those shadows in there. So I went with my gut on what I know from experience works better and was definitely glad that I went ahead and shaded that. And this is an area where I've just broken it up into one section at a time. I will get it mostly finished and then I'll move on to the next section. But it's easier for me to just paint the face here before I work on the body. Just really focus on getting most of this done. So I'm going to block in this next section. And I need a lot more with the oranges on this. You can see where I'm adding a lot of those shades or the shadows with the deeper burgundy color. And for a lot of the burgundies, I'm getting that by mixing red with a little bit of brown. So here's another area where you can see under that fin, I shaded quite a bit more than what I had on the reference photo. So you can see the scales that I've put there with the yellow. I've got the yellow mixed with a little bit of white and a little bit of orange, and I've created little kind of half circles approximately where those scales are going to go. They are not exact. Like I said earlier, I could see them more on the reference photo than you typically would see on a clownfish when you see them in person. So I went ahead and put those in now, and I'm going to glaze a lot of the darker colors over it. So you just get that subtle hint of those being there. Right now they're really harsh. I'm not going to leave them like that. But this is helping me to create that little bit of texture, little bit of detail. I've got to make sure, just like if I were painting feathers or fur, that those are going in the right direction. And you can see how they curve around the body. That is part of what helps that body to look like it's slightly rounded and that the fish isn't totally flat. Now, the orange by itself, I don't use too often. I'm usually mixing it with another color because it has a very fluorescent tone to it all on its own. Getting my shadow here with that burgundy. blocking in this next section of white. That is a tack-on bristled filbert, one of the generic ones from Hobby Lobby. I've mentioned those before. I love their generic brushes, and they go on sale for half price about once a month. So this back end of the fish, I don't want much detail back here. This is where it starts to get back out of focus again. So I just need to make sure that I've got my coloring about right. Now here's a little bit different. That black, I need it to be fuzzy, so I've got to blend it wet into wet on that back end. Not the part I'm doing right now, that's more harsh. But that back end, I needed that to be a little bit more fuzzy, so I did blend it into the orange because there's no yellow at that point, just a little bit. I had to be careful not to go out of control with that because, again, I don't want that ugly muddy color, but I also needed that to be a lot fuzzier than I did on any other area where I had blended the black, like on the face, where I blended the black into the orange, or the yellow. Doing the little details around that fin. So I've got this shadow. This is a much stronger shadow than any of the other areas where I'm going to add the shadows on the white. Just because of the location of it, and it's reflecting more browns than what you'll see later on. You can see back here, it's pretty loosely painted in just to keep it fuzzy. And they've got the reflection, or not the reflection, but you can see the fin through that anemone right there, or the arm there. So I've got that darker black, but it's not straight black because I don't want it to look like the fin is in front of that anemone, but you can see it through. You can see here is where I'm talking about where I've better defined some of these highlights than what is in that photo. So the highlight that I've got going along the back, and it'll end up coming across the white and the face of the clownfish. That wasn't in the reference photo, but it's one of those things that I will usually do on most fish that help it to look that much more detailed, that much more realistic. So there I'm using the transparent mixing white to get some of these highlights. Getting some of these details, little dots. These ones are with the brown. That is the raw umber. And actually, that line that I just did, I didn't even notice that until seeing it now. That's part of the reflection from that back fin. I'm glad I put it in the right location. Now that I'm looking at it on the video, I can see that better. So here I'm mixing a bit of blue and purple and adding the shadow underneath or on the bottom section of the white. Getting that dark in first allowed me to come back through with a liner brush and get some detail, just little tiny areas. Again, it's the scales that you were able to see or I was able to see on the reference photo, but I don't want them that well defined. But that's what I've done there, just those little specks. Some highlights over the black, and that is using the blue and transparent mixing white. I can never remember that name. Every time I go to say it, I always hesitate because I blank out again. Part of it is in oil paints, it would be called zinc white. In acrylics, it's transparent mixing white. And I mix them up, and my brain just kind of is like, no, I don't know what you're trying to say right now. So this is pretty much where I stopped for the night. It was about 5 in the morning. So I let it be and then came back with fresh eyes the next morning. Well, it was actually this morning. And I can see here my clownfish just doesn't glow enough. He doesn't stand out enough. And part of that is that my background, these back pieces or portions of the anemone just blend in too much with the clownfish. So what I'm doing here is taking that raw umber and glazing that over this area, darkening these bits of the anemone up quite a bit. Now I'm going to have to do this in a couple of layers. The reason for that is I need it to be translucent enough that it blends in softly where it looks just like the areas that I had airbrushed earlier. The other reason is that if I just layered on top of layer, it has to dry completely. If it's not 100% dry, it'll just lift off when I add the next layer. So I'll add a layer, it's not going to be dark enough, and then I'll come back, add another layer, that won't be dark enough, and I will just repeat that process until I get it as dark as I want it. But that way I still end up with that softer, out of focus look like I want. If I put the paint on very thick, my brush strokes would show too much and it would look too much like the portions of the anemone that are up close. Definitely not what I wanted. So here I've slowed this down. We're going to go into real time so you can see more how I'm doing my brush strokes. This is the transparent mixing white that I'm using for the highlights on the clownfish. Really want his head to just pop out a lot more than what he currently did. Now it's a little too much. I'll have to glaze the yellow over that. But I've got to get the white down first. And I don't just want to mix the white and the yellow because, again, I want to have that glow. I want that transparency that and the way that the light will refract through that I get from glazing. Plus, if I use a color that is very opaque, like if I just mix titanium white with the yellow, it's going to cover up all of the glazing that I did before because it's too opaque. So I want to make sure that I keep using these translucent layers. You can see I constantly am pausing because I keep looking at that reference photo. Softening up a little bit more. The scales that I had there were a little bit too well defined, so I've gone over them with the transparent mixing white, and it just kind of solidifies that area just a bit so it doesn't have as much detail there. And then I'll glaze over that. And I know it'll feel scary. When I'm adding these highlights, it looks like it's too much. Like, oh my gosh, you just ruined everything you did. Once that glaze goes over it, it pushes it all together. So I'm almost just dry brushing here. That paint is pretty dry on the brush. You can see it's because it's so dry, the bristles are starting to separate, and it's almost working kind of like a rake brush would, where I'm getting a lot of different strokes or little hair marks out of the one brush stroke. But up in that area that I was doing up on the upper back, that works because it just gives you that feel of scales. So here you can see where I'm glazing that brown. I'm being pretty light with that because I do have a lot of glazes under it. I don't want to scrub that off completely. And then I'm using that stiff round brush just to smudge out the edges. And then that fan brush gets rid of the mop brush, just a couple of brush strokes, softened it out even more so it looks like it fits in with the portions that are airbrushed around it. But getting that darker really helped to push that clownfish forward. And it was actually dark in the reference photo, or darker than what I had it. I made it a little bit more brown. It had a little bit more of a yellow tone, and a lot of times when you put too much yellow in an area, or very much yellow, that brings the yellow itself will bring that area closer to the subject. And because I want to push that portion back, I just went with brown. Darkening up this area as well. You can see with the stiff round brush, I'm just smudging out the edges, and then I use the center section. I blend that out with the mop brush. If you have an area that is that wet and you're using that stiff round brush to try to blend the center areas out, you end up just pushing the paint out and you end up with this heavy ring around the edge, which you don't want. So you can see there, that's why I blended with the stiff round brush just on the outside edge, and then the mop brush for the inside brush strokes. And it just needed a couple of brush strokes to get that soft. So I'm coming back through with a liner brush and really focusing on detail. You can really see on the real time how often I'm stopping and looking at that reference photo. It's really boring for you guys to watch, but it also gives you a bit more of a sense of how often I'm stopping and studying that photo and deciding what extra details, what else I need to make mine look more like it. So I'm doing a lot with little teeny tiny dots at this point. I'll do a little bit of a line and then I'll dot, a little bit of a line and I'll dot. I do that a lot when I'm working on underwater things. Now these dots, again, like a lot of what I've done with the white, it's too harsh, but that's okay because I will glaze back over that. And what's happening is the dots that I've done previously, they're very subtle. When you look at the piece in person, you can see the texture. You can see them there underneath all of those other glazes. This is part of what builds the depth in this. So some of these dots feel like they're more inside the arm of the anemone because there are so many glazed colors over them, and then more dots and then more colors. And the dots aren't just on top of where I've previously put dots. They're in new locations. I mean, they're in the same zone, the same highlighted area, but they're not just being placed right on top of my previous dots either. I need those previous ones to show through. What I'm doing is dabbing after I do a lot of these dots, like that portion of the anemone was farther away. So I just dabbed it with my finger to smudge it out, which helps it to look more like the slightly out of focus portions. I don't want it to be quite as crisp and harsh as the ones up front. You can see I'm really making sure that all of these lines are very precise at this point. This is where the ones up front here, I really need these to be very crisp. The way that I'm doing these dots, it's pretty much how I've done all of them, where I was talking about earlier, the beginning portions of, or the beginning layers of dots that I had done. I go through that very quickly. I'm careful on my edges, but as far as just adding the dots themselves, that part's pretty fast. So here I'm really needing to start defining the anemone that goes in front of the clownfish. They sort of look like they're a part of him right now. I need to fix that. So we'll speed this back up. I think you got the point of how I was doing those lines and dots. See how I'm making these portions of the anemone stand out a little bit more, and so I'm outlining them and just smudging it, and it helps it to create that kind of backlit glow. Now here's that highlight I was talking about that runs up the back. You can see I've gone over the white, and I will do a little bit more over the black portions. And over the black portions, I will glaze blue over it because I don't want just white on both. So we've got those highlights here. I'll come back through and glaze a bit of yellow and orange over that. That yellow is obviously a bit on the fluorescent side, so I'll tone that down even more with orange after. And that is just straight yellow. So now we'll mix in some of that orange. I've got a little bit of red in with it, so it's not too fluorescent still. Here I'm glazing that. I've mixed the burgundy color with a little bit of magenta. So anywhere where I've got these white highlights, you can see I'm not leaving them very bright. The brightest portions, I've got some on the tips of the anemone, but even those are going to get toned down. The brightest portions, I go right back over it with a glaze of another color. But these guys, the anemone, they have a lot of translucency to their arms, so I want to make sure that I'm capturing that. Now this brush that I'm using is a 0 liner brush. It is a Taklon bristle and it is super thin, so I can get the really, really small lines that I can't get with my synthetic hog hair. The synthetic hog hair is just a little bit too thick. I've got more control with this 0. And remember, no matter which type of brush you're using, the harder you push with it, the thicker your line is going to be. If you barely let it touch, you can get a much, much thinner line. So here I've got more of that magenta color that I'm going over some of the highlights with. And this is thinned down a bit with water. This is really getting to the stage where I stop paying as much attention to the reference photo and I just start backing up away from it and deciding what my piece needs to look better. I take photos and look at it that way on my phone. Anything that gives me a better idea of what I might want to adjust. You can see that white edge or that highlight that I put on that anemone that's right going across kind of the middle of the body of the clownfish. Look at how that sets that forward so much more than not having that highlight be as sharp. I'm coming on top of this with purple to get some of my darks a little bit darker. And by doing that, that helps the lighter portions of the anemone to push forward and stand out that much more, just creating more contrast. That is really it for this guy. Again, if you want to see the reference photo that he used, you can go over to graphicstock.com and just type in clownfish and you'll see a selection of what they've got. But tomorrow I will have that code or the link where you can get your 7-day free trial and then download 140 of them if you want to get that. They have so many good photos over there. So I was pretty excited about this. I've already downloaded so many for myself. They've got a lot of things that I wasn't able to find on other reference photo sites, or I couldn't find as many quality of like the clownfish, like this one. I have tried to find good photos and I just hadn't found any that stood out to me like this one did. So that's pretty exciting. And yeah, if you guys have any questions, just let me know.